Our show wouldn't exist without you listening. But if you want more information on how to become a guest, how to recommend a guest, or just to stay in touch, go to flippinthelid.com. We'll see you there. Welcome back, everybody. You know what we do here on Flippin' the Lid, and I just get excited every time we have someone who's willing to flip open their lid, scan their can, go inside, and really unpack the elements of their stories that have helped make them who they are today. Today, our guest is no different. We've attempted to have this interview a handful of times, and life happens, and we've rescheduled, but I'm also a big believer in surrender and the fact that the timing is always perfect if we allow it to be. In the 5 minutes at pre-show talking with our guest today, it was very clear the resonance, alignment that we both share, but the purpose and intention for how he has actually created a very unique solution to be able to allow people to reboot their minds, step into who they are by better understanding the elements of their past and the intellectual and emotional narratives to get wrapped up in them. He does this work professionally, but he had to do it for himself. And he talked about the intent of doing this and creating this simply for his daughter. So, Don, I'm excited to have you here today, my friend.
Well, thanks, Brian. We like you said, we finally got this together. There were a couple of different things that interfered with our schedule, so I'm glad we got it on the books.
Life happens, and so that's something I've surrendered to. I'm also very grateful. The only question I ask every single one of our guests is, I introduced you based on the little bit I know about you, the little bit of interaction we've had, but who are you in your words?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, if you go back to who I am, I'm a dad, I'm a father, I'm a husband, right? So that's who I am at my core. What I do for a living is just what I do, but I do it really more from the passion of it, so I help people basically perform at their highest level by eliminating these traumatic events that they've experienced in their life. And that's just interfering with them reaching their highest level of performance and enjoying life to the maximum.
Yeah, I love that. Our listeners will know this, but I'm often known as the garbage man because I help people go inside and identify and remove the trash from their past that continues to show up as their biggest problems in business, relationships, life, and health. It's no different than what you said. I also did like the distinction. I did ask you who you were, and you started with who, and then you ended with what, which was a very beautiful distinction. Oftentimes, if people aren't prepared or clear enough on who they are, they just answer with what they do. And for you, starting with husband, dad, right, grandfather, all of the elements that are the core of who you are was a very beautiful way to start. When did you realize that that was the core of who you were, and when did you start answering the who are you question leading with that?
That's a great question. I don't know when it started. I just know I've always sort of felt that way. I've always had this belief in my identity and who I was, and that came from growing up in a very secure world. I never really had any doubt about who I was and my strengths. And so that I give all the credit in the world to my parents, which were incredible human beings who raised me in this nurturing, loving environment. So I think and I was adopted. So that's probably a very interesting fact.
It is.
That a lot of people would say, oh, gee, well, you're adopted. I would get this all the time. You must be so angry at your mother for giving you away. And I would say, no, quite the opposite. I honor her because I think it was an amazing sacrifice. I don't know if I could ever do that.
No.
But she did that. And because of the life I had growing up, I really lucked out. I mean, getting adopted by the parents that I got adopted by, you couldn't have asked for a better world.
Yeah. Well, I think your clarity on that is pretty amazing as well. I mean, obviously being adopted is one thing, but we talked about this concept of safety pre-show. And you just hit on it now, right? This nurturing, loving, protected environment where you were conditioned and given opportunity to grow and step into who you were in a safe place that gave you permission to do so. Right? That is a highly unique piece. And I want to come back to that, but I also am really curious. When did you realize and shift yourself into gratitude around the sacrifice that your mother, your biological mother made to ensure you had a better life than she thought she could provide for you?
Well, Brian, I don't think I ever knew any other way. So I don't think there was a shift. It was just, I just grew up in that. And beautiful. My mother was very loving, very huggy, very touchy. My dad was the opposite. He was very British, but he loved us, never raised his voice, never yelled at us, right? We can't even remember my parents arguing. That's a very unique world to grow up in.
Extremely unique.
So I could get bumped every once in a while by a teacher, a coach, a friend. But as soon as I came home, I came back into this world of safety and I felt regulated again. And so that's what I think was the key to me always having that belief that I was safe and very, I guess, tuned in to who I was.
Yeah. There are a lot of people who brush over their childhood, believing that it's not traumatic. They don't have elements of it. When I receive you talking about this, the congruence and alignments and conviction and clarity that you have in your words tells me that not only you do this work for other people, but you've done it for yourself to really understand where you've come from, the patterns that have come into your life, and allowed yourself to bring them to a place of consciousness. In fact, most people, when we're in a position where we're unpacking their childhood, might say that they've got something where they felt safe, protected, their parents were good, but then we realize that the deepest level of shame, the deepest trash that they've buried, their anger, their perfection, their control, came from the environment and they just weren't conscious to it. It's obvious the work you've done, and it's really beautiful to hear you talk about this safe, nurturing environment, because to your point, it's rare, right? We, in our situation, my wife and I'll tell you, 2.5 years ago, unpacked anger in me that I didn't know existed. It was generationally inherited. It was patterned down, that had to do with some of the external pieces that took place in my body. But reality of it is I didn't see it. I was unconscious to it because it was so normal and patterned in. Did you always know how unique your adopted situation was? Or was it later in life that you realized that?
Definitely later in life. I thought everybody was living in my world. I had zero clue that everybody else had all this stuff going on because nobody talked about it. Yeah. I didn't know about the traumas. I didn't know about the dysfunction in their worlds. It really wasn't until I met my wife and we became close very quickly. So then I was around her world, in her life a lot more. So I was around her home because we were so close. And I sensed there was something wrong, but I didn't know what it was. I couldn't understand this tension that I was feeling, and I couldn't understand the fakeness. Everybody seemed fake. The I love yous didn't seem real. The hugs felt forced. And I was looking saying, something's off, but I don't know what it is. And then I saw it with her father's violence and temper. They hid it from me as long as they could. Yeah. But I was around too often. Then all of a sudden, boom. And I was like, well, this is unusual. This can't be happening anywhere else. I still didn't understand it. I still thought this was an anomaly. I didn't realize that my world was the anomaly.
Which is extremely shifting and jarring when you start to realize that you are the unique one that came from a different place, but you also had the ability very quickly to understand the perspective and contrast based on what your body was telling you in those scenarios, right? You were listening and you were paying attention. So when you say that you were detecting that something felt fake, how did that show up in your body, and what did and how did you experience it at the time?
It made me uneasy because I didn't understand what it was. And so it made me curious as to what is this? Why is, now obviously she's just my girlfriend at the time.
Yeah.
Why is she living with this fear all the time? I could say something as simple as, no, I don't like that. And she could tear up and start to cry. Yeah. And she'd say, why are you upset with me? And I'd go, I'm not upset at all. Right. And I wasn't. And what I didn't understand at that time is she wasn't wrong and I wasn't wrong. Mm-hmm. So when a child grows up in that kind of a world, they're highly sensitive to sound. Correct. This is what I found in my research. So if I said, no, I don't like that, but there was just this 0.5% of a change in my tone, that sounded like I was yelling to her. Mm-hmm. She was so sensitive to that change. I couldn't hear it if you paid me. You could have recorded me with and without that tension, and the tension could have come in from just me being tired at the end of the day, right? Or maybe I was a little frustrated on the drive over, but I'm not angry at her at all, but she's looking for it because that's how she protected herself.
Sounds very similar to patterns that took place in our household when we first started living together, and we were starting to unpack those pieces, because I grew up in a household where there was a right and a wrong way to do everything. Right. And so for me, but I also came from a household where my parents would take their shirts off their backs to help anybody in any situation. And so often what I would do is simply offer advice or direction, like, hey, babe, have you ever considered loading the dishwasher this correctly? Or loading the dishwasher this way, right? And it would come across as control, and I'm telling her what to do, and it was a shaming piece, when in my true, genuine intent, I was simply attempting to help, right? And we talk a lot about the armor that prevents us from actually connecting at the deepest level and being seen and understood, because the second we protect ourselves, we disconnect ourselves, right? Emotionally, intellectually, spiritually, and physically from the space that we're in. And so many people have patterned that in so deeply. It took us years to realize that. So you and your wife are dating. You start to notice these anomalies, these differences in the way that you're experiencing the world. You're starting to pattern together these moments where you're coming in calm, cool, and collected, but she's receiving the message as conflict or arise or anger or compression. How many years did you guys date before you get married? And how quickly did you start talking about this as partners to better understand each other?
We actually didn't date very long. I was offered a contract to play professional hockey in Sweden at 19. I met her at 18. So we were really just over a year that we were dating. And when I got that offer, I said, well, let's get married, right? And I'm thinking, I'm going to get her out of this world, right? Because I loved her and I saw how special she was. She's a phenomenal human being, a loving, caring person. She was just very severely injured. And so I thought, okay, well, if I get her out of this world, she'll be living in my world, and all of that problem will go away. And it didn't.
Of course it didn't.
No. So she's a great mom, a great wife. I mean, I'm happy, but she's not enjoying the success we were having. So it took a long time for me to understand. I kept thinking, well, maybe I need to make more money. Maybe I have to change the way I say things. I got to be more careful, the words I choose. And yet I could activate her nervous system so easily, just even with a look, a shrug of my shoulders. And I always use the word activate. I never liked the word trigger. I always thought trigger sounded negative and violent. I don't believe our minds are negative and violent. They're activating a response. And so I would activate her with very little. And I get to a point that sometimes I would get a little frustrated and say, I didn't say it that way, and I can't speak like a robot. So it's just, I may have had a little frustration, something, I'm doing, and she comes up and says, what's wrong? And I'm just like frustrated because something's not working, but I'm not upset with her. But she would internalize it.
Yep.
And the way her mind would internalize it was, I'm not safe again.
Yep.
And there's where her activation would come in.
Thank you for putting words to normalize what so many relationships, whether they're intimate or not, experience. We talk about this deeply in our world. And, what's interesting is I do like the word trigger, but I like the word trigger only from the sense that we get to pull the trigger on our emotional triggers if we choose to, right? The reality of it is a trigger is simply a reactionary point in our ability to activate a response is what we're really trying to gain. Right. It's the difference between my wife saying, hey, what do you want to do with the kids this weekend? But my shame filter caused me to hear, hey, honey, you've not done enough to be a good husband and father here recently. So what are you going to do to make up for it this weekend? Not what she said, not how she delivered it, but that's how I heard it. Right. And that's what I was reacting to, which had nothing to do with what was right in front of me. So
I call that the words and the music.
Yeah.
Right. The words were this, but the music was loving.
Yeah.
But you hear the words that way, even though she was saying it in a loving manner.
Bingo.
Right? It's like, if you ever listen to a song and you love this song, and then somebody goes, yeah, have you ever listened to the lyrics, what they're talking about? They're talking about freebasing cocaine. And you're like, what? No, they're not.
So I never listen to the lyrics of songs, and my wife only listens to the lyrics. I'm like all about beat and bass and like, how does the song go together? Like, and I don't care what genre it is. Like, I just don't listen to the messages of songs. I listen to how I feel when I listen to them. She's all about the words. And so it's that exact same dynamic has happened. I like that. The music and the words. Yeah, that's a really good phrase.
That's what it comes down to, is the words, right, do not match with the music the way they're interpreting it. And so that's going to activate them. And they sometimes can't hear the music because they're focused on the words.
Yeah.
So like you just said, it's a great way to explain it to somebody, because then it sort of takes a lot of that shame out of it.
It does.
Is of course, if you heard those words, like, that's why I use the analogy of a song, right? You could listen to the song and love the music, have no idea what the words were until somebody tells you, and then you're like, oh, I don't like that song anymore.
Yeah, you realize you're celebrating a song that's all about hate, violence, and killing people. Oh, yeah, no, I didn't actually. So, yeah, no, I've definitely been there. It's so real and so true, and it's so difficult to start to navigate, and it's so deeply embedded. But I also really appreciate what you just said. The very first thing that we have to get people to acknowledge, whether it's we call it trauma, we call it trash from our past, whatever the reality is we have to be able to raise our level of awareness without simultaneously raising all the ways that we should be judging ourselves, right? We have to remove the shame and blame, and we have to realize that 99% of the time, trash from our past is not our fault. It just becomes our responsibility once we become aware of it or we start burying others in ours. That distinction is a huge shift that I see even in counseling, therapy, coaching across the board, that there's still this underlying shame and blame associated with all the things that people should or shouldn't be doing. When did you start understanding the dynamics of shame in your work, in your life? And how did you start to be able to create those safe spaces while facilitating opportunity for conversation on the topics that need to be discussed?
I think it wasn't really till I did the research that I truly understood it. But for an example, with my wife, Bridget, so when I proposed to her, she was excited. Yes, we're going to get married. And then she got real serious and said, okay, she says, if we're going to get married, I want to share with you everything I've experienced in my life up till now. And if that changes your mind and you don't want to marry me, I'll understand. That's exactly the word she used.
Wow.
And the first thing I'm thinking is, oh, they've got bodies buried in the backyard. There's got to be something huge here.
You're thinking doom and gloom for sure.
If she's framing it like this, I'm thinking massive problems, right? And I'm like, well, I really don't understand. And then she just shared with me some of the things that experienced. You know, she had dealt with some abuse. She had other things. And I was like, oh, that's it. It was almost like she set me up for this big thing, right? And she tells me, and I go, no, that doesn't affect me at all. And so she says, okay. She says, okay, then you have to promise me this. I said, what? She goes, you'll never tell anybody what I shared with you. That made no sense to me.
Yeah.
I said, why? And she says, well, because people will judge me. They'll judge my family. I don't want anybody to know that. So you have to promise me you'll never share it. That's that shame and guilt.
Well, and that's the burying and the pushing down, because they think that the world's not going to accept them for who they are. Exactly.
And so she just didn't want to. And if she tried to talk about it, even with me, she was crying. And so many of those, sometimes I call them, there's not always big T traumas. I wrote my second book, I called it emotional concussions.
Oh,
because
beautiful.
they're an emotional concussion.
Yeah.
And so she had one where she started to tell me about, again, now she's living in this traumatic world anyway. She's 6 years old, and the mothers in the neighborhood decided to put a little tea party together. So her grandmother dressed her up in a pretty dress, and she's a girly girl. So she's all excited. Her hair is done. She shows up, and when the mothers greet her, one of the mothers says, oh, look at Bridget. She is going to be a real heartbreaker when she grows up. And all the other mothers are like, oh, yeah, that's a real heartbreaker there. Bridget's sobbing as she's telling me this story. And she says, I felt sick to my stomach and I wanted to go home.
Yeah.
What she heard was, you're a bad person. You're going to break people's hearts. And so she's living in this world where she's feeling all of this already. And that was just a confirmation that she's bad.
Yeah.
Right. And she had no idea that the mothers were complimenting her. She took it, as what do they see in me? Because she's 6 and she has no life experience to understand what those words meant.
That's right. That's another beautiful example. I love the simplicity of the examples that you give, because again, I'm someone, and we haven't talked before this, but I had a pretty significant physical trauma. My left arm was torn from my body. It was reattached. I've had 24 surgeries. There was a lot to my story of unpacking as a result of that. But the reason I say that is the relevance of what you just said, and how deeply I'm hoping that resonates with everybody is, it doesn't matter the size of your trauma. It doesn't matter the size of your story. It doesn't matter right? The extremities on any of that, because the reality of it is it's your perspective, it's your experience, and it's your reality. So even something as simple as your grandpa looking at you incorrectly when you're 4 can still set off this cellular memory that when you receive that same type of energy or look 30 years later, you're reacting feeling not good enough about yourself because of some embedded message that the world's only further validated with your belief. And it's so simple, right?
So simple. I got a great example. I had a lady who said to me, we were doing a group presentation. And so I always do a demonstration with somebody who's had a trauma, and I take them through the process. And so there's one lady volunteers. She comes up, and as soon as she sits down, she says, I never had any trauma when I was growing up. And I'm like, what did you volunteer for? Right? You're going to make my job 10 times harder. But anyway, I said, okay, can you think of a time that you had an event that would make you cry if you think about it now? And so she's thinking about it. She goes, okay, yeah, I've got one. She says, I was about 6 and I was sitting in church with my family. And she says, and I was talking to my siblings and my grandmother, and I can see her eyes filling up. And she says, my grandmother took out the brush in her purse and hit me on the head and said, stop talking, you're in church. And then the waterworks started. And as she was trying to catch her breath, she said this, I just realized I lost my voice that day.
Bingo.
Never occurred to her. She goes, I never fight back. I never stand up for myself. People push me around. I never realized why.
Yep.
Now, was her grandmother trying to do that? No,
not at all. Her grandma's intent was probably good. It's just she didn't know any better.
But a 6-year-old heard, we don't want to hear from you.
Bingo.
That's how she interpreted that.
And the reality of it is it's no different than, a grandpa or grandma getting upset if their grandkid doesn't hug them when they see them. And all of a sudden what that sends is a message that I'm only going to love you if it's done on my terms. It's contingent. It's based on performance. And there's these subtle embedded pieces that literally create these patterns in our lives that we sometimes don't ever become conscious to unless we're being intentional about doing that. So, you largely were getting experience around understanding the perspective outside of your own unique world and how others are impacted. So what was your drive for studying the impact of trauma on people's minds and lives, and when did that journey start?
Well, as Bridget says, we were the perfect petri dishes for this because I knew what the model was. I knew what it was like to feel that peace.
Yeah.
Right. And so she was teaching me everything about it. But it wasn't until my daughter was diagnosed with Crohn's at 14.
Right.
And we had no idea what Crohn's was. Like, what is Crohn's? Why she got Crohn's? And they told us there's no cure for Crohn's. We don't know what creates Crohn's. She's going to have to live with it for the rest of her life. And she ended up having 4 resections done. They took out 24 inches of her intestines. And they said, take her off of gluten, take her off of dairy, all these things that they were saying. And they just had her on a constant dose of steroids. And then they put her on antidepressants, anti-anxiety meds. That was how they were solving it. But they weren't solving it. They were managing it.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so that's an autoimmune disorder. And then a few years later, she gets a second autoimmune where her lungs, she started coughing up blood. And so she was basically, the iron in the blood was being released into the lungs. It's another autoimmune disorder called idiopathic pulmonary hemosiderosis. And only 1 in 1.2 million people get it. So it's very rare.
Yeah.
But again, they told us there's no cure for it. We don't know what causes it. And it wasn't until that happened, that's when Bridget said to me, you were adopted. This must be coming from your side of the family, right? You need to figure this out or we're going to lose our daughter, because that technically could be a death sentence. So that's when I went back, got my PhD and started to research to try to save my daughter. And what I discovered as I was researching is all these people I was meeting who had all these autoimmune disorders and health issues all had one connection: trauma.
Yep.
So I said, okay, well, I know how they're treating the physical. They're managing the physical. How are they treating the trauma?
Yeah.
The same way. Manage it.
Mm-hmm.
Learn how to deal with your anxiety. Learn how to deal and manage your issues. And I said, why aren't we fixing it?
Right.
So that's what I realize is we can actually fix it. We don't have to live with it. And
I completely agree with you. And I'm grateful that you are out there doing the work that you're doing, because it is fixable. The problem is that we largely only focus on things from an intellectual understanding perspective and physical treatment, but we don't ever really understand the emotional and spiritual connection that is also the cellular memory that's keeping us stuck. Right. Well, you said that you were a doctor, but it was your daughter that drove you down this path of researching trauma and going back and getting your doctorate.
No, actually, I wasn't even a doctor.
You weren't a doctor yet. So what were you doing at the time?
I was an entrepreneur.
What were you doing?
I was an entrepreneur. I just had different businesses, and that was what made me go and say, okay, if I'm going to do this, I've got to go back and get the PhD so that I can add the credibility to the research I'm going to do. And so I think that was my big advantage, Brian, is I came in as an entrepreneur, not as wanting to learn how to be a therapist or a psychologist. So I
focus on fixing problems.
What do entrepreneurs do?
Yeah.
They find solutions to problems. And
that's right.
So I researched it from a completely different perspective of saying there's a problem, they're not fixing it.
And what did you find was the major gap that existed when you started down this path of research?
The thing that I discovered is that unresolved trauma creates inflammation in the body.
Bingo.
Inflammation compromises the immune system, compromises the neurotransmitters. So that means you're going to get sicker because your immune system's compromised, and you're going to feel bad because your neurotransmitters are compromised.
Yep.
And they're just going to manage that. And so people say inflammation's the problem. No, it's not. It's chronic inflammation that's the problem. And trauma keeps the inflammation active because it creates a loop.
Yep.
And the trauma loop keeps the activation of the inflammation because your subconscious mind, as you know, operates in the present. So when it starts to activate memory from something 20 years ago, 15 years ago, even if it's below your conscious awareness, it sees memory in real time. So it's now going to create a response to it. And so it's going to go into an activation, which is inflammation. That's a temporary pause to protect the system.
Yep. It's
not supposed to stay on. It's supposed to turn on when there's a threat and shut off when there isn't a threat.
Yep.
So, so the accident you talked about, you would have gone into an inflamed state. That's a physical injury. The purpose of that inflammation was to protect you from anything penetrate the cells so that nothing gets into the cell on that short term. And then once the injury starts to heal, the inflammation will come down, the immune system will come in and take care of it.
In my case, you're exactly right. But what also happened is when I shut off physical pain because it exceeded my ability to cope, I shut off emotional pain, spiritual pain, and mental pain for 20 to 25 years. And I only ever healed physically from the injury that I had. And it caused all these other ancillary effects. Inflammation. I had daily pain for almost 31 years. My nervous system was tapped, right? And yet I was doing lots of these external measures with body work and energy work and going down all the alternative mechanisms, trying to figure out the path. And it was only when I started to really go deep inside that I found freedom, right? And I started to regulate. You know, I've said for years that if we don't feel, we don't heal. And you're probably familiar with sensory neurites, which are those brain-like cells in the heart that carry cellular memory. And that's exactly what you're talking about. Our bodies often are reacting to things that have nothing to do with what's right in front of us because of all of the conditioning that we've carried through all the years, consciously and unconsciously.
I call it a glitch, an error message. The mind is looping through faulty intelligence.
Yes.
And so it keeps on responding to the faulty intelligence because it thinks the intelligence is accurate.
Yeah.
It's old. It has nothing to do with now.
So what were the greatest lessons that you learned in helping people integrate and regulate and heal through the divide in their intellectual and emotional narratives that took place in these moments of trauma?
What I realized is that they were stuck in this loop. And as long as that loop was running, and so in the research that I found is the mind is always trying to survive. It's always survival based. And so what it does is it keeps on using memory as its resource. So if you've got a lot of traumatic memory and it keeps on looking at the traumatic memory to know how to respond to now, it's going to continue to keep the system on alert.
Yeah.
And then you go into this hypervigilant state. And so if your mind looks at something, so for example, I worked with a U.S. Army sniper. He had to shoot and kill a 12-year-old boy. And as he was trying to tell me what happened, he was just shaking and crying. And so by the time I took him through the whole program, he could give me a complete description without shaking and crying.
Yeah.
And he goes, how did you do that? He said, why am I not shaking and crying? And I says, because for the last 8 years, your mind is trying to get you not to pull the trigger.
Yeah.
It's looking for a resolution to that. And the resolution would be, don't shoot. Your mind doesn't know that you're not shooting, right? That's impossible to do. And so it just keeps creating the response. And there's where your mind would feel the pain. Once we reset, reboot the system, we're basically taking that intensity out of the memory. The mind won't call for the action anymore. And what I say is when you have an emotion, the purpose of an emotion is a call for an action. The purpose of fear is to escape a threat. The purpose of anger is to attack a threat. So if you think about something that happened to you 10 years ago and your heart's pounding in your chest, what your mind is thinking is you need to run now.
Yep.
Because it's looking at 10 years ago as now.
Yeah. Beautifully described. You know, it's one thing to develop something for a daughter, which is profound, significant, purpose-driven, no doubt. It's a whole nother when you've got personal perspective. So I'm really curious, what have been the traumas or mini T's, as you call them, in your life that you had to work through yourself?
I think most of it came in my adulthood with my daughter, because that became my trauma.
Yeah.
So, and the biggest frustration for me was, especially before I ever thought about doing this is when we were just dealing with her symptoms. We didn't know the core, the trauma. She never disclosed to us the trauma she'd experienced when she was younger. So when we first, were dealing with this, it was all coming from the physical side.
Yeah.
And it was so frustrating not to have answers. That created, especially more for my wife than even me, I think I had a built-in resiliency because of my childhood.
Yeah.
And so I was able to handle it a lot better than she was able to handle it. And then when we found out that my daughter had dealt with some sexual abuse at 6 that we didn't know about, then my wife really had a problem with that, because she said, how did I not see this?
Right.
I always thought I could protect my children from this. So there was a whole bunch of more shame and guilt that came out for Bridget, right? That then aggravated her old situation from her childhood. And so when I developed the program, I had to also help her with all of that.
Which is very real, very, very real. I mean, grieving the loss of a life that you envisioned for your kid, or grieving the loss of the perceived protection that we can hold in moments of innocence that we weren't present for, we immediately can put that shame and blame on ourselves. And again, it's such simple situations sometimes that we can't even influence or control, but they happen. And we have to your point, activate a response to allow ourselves to move.
And that's what I talk about. What's the purpose of shame and guilt?
Yeah.
It's to fix something.
Mm-hmm.
What is your mind trying to fix? What happened? Can it fix what happened? So religion learned that trick a long time ago. If they can get you to feel guilty or shameful, they can change your behavior. They can change your actions. Well, your mind is actually pretty good at doing that too. It learned that trick, that if we can put enough shame and guilt on Brian, he won't do it, right? But you already did it.
Yeah.
So the shame and guilt is going to keep showing up until you resolve what that original core issue was.
Yeah. We always say until you get to the root source of those emotions or those traumas, you won't actually resolve them. You'll continue to repeat the same patterns until you can understand them and separate from them in the moment. How many years of research did it take you to develop the TIP method? And can you describe that a little bit to us? And then give us a little bit of an understanding on what that process looked like in developing it.
So I started doing the research in about 2009 and spent about probably 4 years doing a lot of the research as I was, working on my education. And then 2015, I started to test out some of my theories of what I was experiencing and getting pretty good results. And then launched the Inspired Performance Institute in 2015. And I'm in continual research. I keep learning more and more. And Brian, it was literally like research kept falling in my lap.
Yeah.
So I really believe that I was led here, that I was just very fortunate to have this upbringing that I had and have this research just keep showing up. And I would find things that I would go, well, this is explaining a lot. This is explaining a lot. And it just kept falling into place. And because I was adopted, we didn't know anything truly about my family history. The only thing that my mom had ever told me when I was 8, and it wasn't until I was 18. And again, I never had any burning desire. I was very happy with my life. So if I ever brought it up, I could see my mom get a little teary-eyed, so I would just leave it alone. But when I was 18, she told me that our family doctor was my grandfather. And he came to them and asked if they would adopt me. And they were older. They were in their 40s. And they said no at first. And then he really insisted. I see why now, right? Why he insisted. So that's about all I knew until about 2 years ago when we had our first grandchild.
Yeah.
And then my daughter decided that we should do the DNA, right, ancestry, and find out our family history. And so I agreed. My parents had passed, so it wasn't going to affect them.
Yeah.
And so what I found out is I have 6 siblings.
Wow.
3 that were born before me and 3 that were born after me. And the difference was I'd been healthy all my life. I've never had a drink in my life, never touched a drug once in my life. But my brothers and sisters, all 6 of them were addicted to drugs and alcohol. But they grew up, and so the 3 that were born before, my mother was in a very violent home with a husband and a father to these children that was an addiction. And so constant beatings, I broke. She just walked out and left the 3 kids. Nobody ever knew where she went. The 3 children that were born before me, 2 died of cancer and 1 has a heart condition. All 3 of them had addiction issues.
Oh.
The 3 that were born after me, my mother had me in the middle. Nobody ever knew I existed. I came out of nowhere 2 years ago. And so the 3 that were born after me all had addiction issues, all had health issues. And I've had none. So that I said, if I could have developed an experiment that started when I was born, I created the perfect experiment was created for me. What's more important, nature or nurture? 100% nurture. I've got my own study, right, that absolutely proves it.
So very rarely do answers happen before a question is asked, but that entire time that you were talking, that's what was hitting hard was nature versus nurture as I'm absorbing all of it. Because genetically, you have the exact same situation and separately, your lives look and pattern forward differently, right? I look at my dad. My dad was the oldest of 5 boys in the Martin Luther King area, and they were one of 4 or 5 families in a 10-mile radius that was white. Lots of trauma, lots of abuse, lots of everything. And he was the oldest, so he took the brunt of it all. He's also the only one that escaped because he was given a chance when he was 17 or 18 to leave. And he did, and he never looked back. Every other one of his brothers was in and out of prison their entire lives, in and out of drug use their entire lives. And so though my dad still has deep, deep, deep trauma that he still has not processed, it's still amazing how just the shift of environment and the nurturing ability that can exist outside of toxicity gave him the opportunity to be a great dad, a great husband, raise us and have a good life when every one of his other siblings was down the complete opposite path. Nature versus nurture is such a powerful thing. I'm curious, from a nature perspective, do you believe that we are all hardwired the same? And if so, what does that look like? And if not, where do you think are some of the nature clues we can lean into to better help understand how we can heal through some of this?
Well, I think the big thing is when people ask me, what's the best advice you can give to a parent? I said, make your home safe.
Yeah.
Because I just wrote my last book. It's going to be coming out in another month or so, called Don't Mess With My DNA. I don't believe the DNA code gets activated until there's a trauma. So there's the big difference. So where does the health issue start showing up? When there's an activation of the code. And that's the epigenetics. It could get passed through the different generations. But the good news, and what I write in the book, is you can heal it.
Yeah.
If you can heal that trauma before it moves on to the next generation. So what I didn't understand at that time is that my wife's trauma was also passing on to our children, even though mine had healed. Mm-hmm. So then when my daughter gets a trauma, where does it show up? I believe it goes to the weakest genetic link in the body. It's there to fortify it. Her intestinal tract was the weaker area from the genetic code. So the inflammation shows up there. And so that's what I believe is happening from the DNA standpoint. But you heal her trauma, even though she's experienced it, it may not pass to her children.
Right.
As long as it's healed. And that, I think, is what the difference. That's what's exciting about the whole field of epigenetics. I believe that we can actually change the way the DNA is read and transcribed.
Yeah, I share a very similar belief with you. And I've just so enjoyed even this conversation up until now. I have to tell you from one proud point, because it was 2.5 years ago, we have effectively reversed the generational patterns in our house. And my kids don't even remember their dad having anger. And again, it all comes back to this concept of safety. That was the whole premise. Is I like to say my wife and I have been together for 17 years. We hid from each other for 14, and she's only felt emotionally safe with me for 12 to 18. And in those 12 to 18 months, the depth of intimacy, the connection, the reestablished trust, the ease that exists between us now after having really done the work, it's possible. It's absolutely possible. 100%. And I wish that there were more people that were showing others what's possible. How have you been able to navigate individuals through the TIP process successfully over time? And what are some of the easiest accessible elements of the TIP method that our listeners could tap into?
Well, the program I developed is actually a 4-hour program followed by about 30 days of audios, 30 to 60, depending on if they're dealing with addiction, we go to 60. But what I say is the first 2 hours of that 4 hours is all on the science. I explain to them what I discovered. And one of the things that I say very early on in that session is there's nothing wrong with you and there's nothing wrong with your mind.
Yep.
I know exactly why you're experiencing what you're experiencing. And if I had lived your life the way you lived your life, I'd be doing it exactly the way you did too. My life was just unique. And that was sort of what taught me that we can all live like that and that peace. I can get bumped. I can get hurt, right? I can get aggravated, but my resiliency to bounce back is so quick. And that came from that early training. Yeah. So because I always felt this sense of safety, I still do today. So even if things are going wrong for me, I still have this belief that I'll fix them.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how yet, but I'll get there, right? So I've always had that where people have been really injured so much in their life that they can't see that. Yeah. I get why they get stuck. So the first 2 hours are education science. Then we start working on trauma. And what I ask for is 2 or 3 events in their life. That's it. And I say, I need a highlight reel, a movie trailer. We're not going into depth. We're not going to analyze this. We're not going to do anything. What does it mean about me? We're basically just going to fix it. We're going to reboot the system. We're going to take it out of high def and put it into low def. And that will stop your mind from creating a response. It's that simple. And then the last hour is all working on performance. Now, what would you like to do in your life? Now that you get your mind cleared and you can change the operation system, right? What's the future look like for you? And then the next 30 days, they listen to the audios. And what I said is we're dealing with 2 memory systems. The first 4 hours is dealing with this explicit memory, the way we stored all the details. We've got to get that rebooted. And then what I say is your mind is a computer. It codes. It is built thousands of codes to protect you from your experiences. So if you've got a lot of traumatic experiences, it's going to build codes, right, to respond to those. We've now got to reprogram those codes by getting your mind to start that process in a safe place. And it's a lot easier to change the codes when your mind is feeling safe. So when I work with people in addiction, I say addiction is not a disease. Addiction is a code. Your brain built a way to protect you from pain.
Yep.
And your subconscious mind wants pain to stop now because it operates in the present. Drugs and alcohol solve the problem now.
Yep.
So your mind doesn't see it as good or bad, right or wrong. It's a computer writing code. When you start typing into your computer code, your computer doesn't say, well, hold on here, I don't think this is a good code. It just accepts the code.
Yeah.
And your subconscious does the same thing. So there's nothing wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with your mind. We just now need to get to the root, clear the root up, and then start working on the codes.
Yeah. And I just appreciate, again, the simplicity and the synergy, even in the way that you and I navigate two totally different frameworks. But the alignment is very, very deep, and it is extremely possible. I like to communicate with folks that we can compress decades into days, sometimes even minutes and moments, if they're willing to actually have the courage to stand in their truth, look at it and understand it for the exact purpose of what you just did. Because otherwise, we live our lives in this fog, this guise. And again, I'll tell you from personal experience, when my nervous system was tapped and I consistently lived in fight or flight, it's because I lacked safety. Right? I lacked safety in myself. I lacked safety in my relationship. I lacked safety in my business. I lacked safety. And I had to not only have the awareness, but I had to step into ownership around the fact that armor always protects pain, which is exactly what you were saying. Right? So every time we're protecting pain or we have a trauma or an experience, we create a layer of armor to protect ourselves from that. So it's a process of healing the pain and shedding the layers of armor to get ourselves back to the core of who we are before the world told us who to be. And you're helping create a pathway to let people do that in 4 hours with deep understanding. And then anywhere between 30 and 60 days of audiobooks to continue to further recondition the pattern. Yep. What have you seen in terms of outcomes and success rates with your program? And what percentage of your students actually get it accomplished in the first run through? And how many others need consistent revisions throughout time?
Great question. So the most important one is if we go to what started it in the first place. My daughter's Crohn's is gone.
Beautiful.
Her lung disorder, gone. No issues. And so what we did is we resolved the trauma, which brought the inflammation down. Crohn's is just inflammation. Yeah. And I believe, so 100% of Crohn's patients are trauma. I can't say that. But in my estimation, I believe most are. I think 80% of the health issues we're dealing with are all psychological.
I agree.
So I have seen people, and if you go to our site, you'll see some amazing testimonials of people who had experienced, from the Boston Marathon to the Vegas shooting to veterans, who in 4 hours their post-traumatic stress is gone. We've reset the system.
I love it.
So what I say is your mind filters through these experiences. If we take these experiences and we reboot them, your mind no longer creates a response to old data.
Oh, yeah.
So the success rate is extremely high, and sometimes hard to imagine that it's as high as it is. But I'll give you a great example. We have an online version of this as well. So this is people just sit and listen to the videos in 4 hours. We just shot it all in virtual reality now too. So that's going to be coming out shortly. So they'll be able to watch it sitting with me in VR. And but we had a guy call up and he said, I heard about your program from a good friend of mine, and he knows you really well. And he said, you need to talk to Dr. Wood. He says, I have an addiction to food. And he says, if I go to bed at night, he says, I'll take 3,000 calories of food into bed as I am in bed and eat it. And he said, and I can't stop it, no matter what I do. And so he said, if I can't come in to see you, can I do your online version? I said, sure, do the online version. If you still think you need more help, I said, just come in and we'll do a one-on-one, you and I together. I says, but I think, from what I'm hearing, I think you'll resonate with the online program. So that was last week. He just called in 2 days ago after going through it and said the first night he brought in a Subway sandwich, chips. He says, and I didn't even eat it. I didn't have any interest really in eating it. He says, and the first time in my life, I woke up the next morning and I wasn't hungry, and it hasn't come back. He says, I can't believe that it could be that fast and easy, but we just reset the system. The reason why he had this desire for food is that was a punishment his parents used when he didn't do what they wanted. They sent him to bed without food.
Yeah.
So what did his mind learn? Make sure you got.
I'm going to hoard food so that I've got everything I need. Right? It's a protectionary armor-based thing again. Yeah. Always. It always is. Always.
100%.
And that's why we always say it's like, I would just believe people always believe they're stuck because they have the wrong strategy and tactics, which is what perpetuates all this 7-step systems for success that exist in this world. But the reality of it is it is always this. It is always the trauma from the past, the trash from the past, the unprocessed or unpacked pieces that are creating reactions in the current moment every single time. Now, what I'm curious about is you have a very strong ability for people to be able to reflect back, remove the trauma, reboot through the TIP method. But trauma happens every day in people's lives. Trauma can be very little micro things that take place in a relationship, in a business, financial loss, divorce, car accidents, right? Like they exist all the way around us, and we're consistently bringing more and more of this patterning into our active self. Right. How do you allow people to identify and remove that on a regular and consistent basis and continue to stay current in rebooting their system?
That's a fabulous question, because that's what it talks about in our program. If you don't resolve the old stuff, right, then you just manage the new stuff.
Yeah.
When you resolve the old stuff, it's easy to resolve the new stuff. So we can all get bumped, right? So even if you've cleared all the trauma and then something comes up like that, business failure, whatever, you've learned through the TIP program the ability to bounce back. And I say, if you've been walking around with a backpack with 150 pounds on it, which was the trauma, and then somebody goes, here's another 10 pounds, that's overwhelming.
Hey.
But if you drop the 150 pounds and then you get a new 10-pound weight,
easy.
It's easy. I can deal with this.
Yeah.
Right? That's what would happen to my wife. She would get overwhelmed by something going wrong, a new thing going wrong, because it was the extra weight on top of what she was already carrying.
I'll speak to that in a very personal example. I told you I was in daily pain for nearly 31 years. I've done a whole lot in the last few to really effectively heal, bring more alignment in. I'm over 4 months now with zero physical pain. And the amount of ease that has existed there has been unbelievable. And, in fact, I've shed multiple layers where I've been floating in life in different moments. But what was crazy is I didn't realize how much I was just barely treading water, thinking I was getting full depth of my breath, when in reality I was gasping for air because of the weight of the unknown stuff that was still working through the cellular memory in my body. And when that left and the pain went with it, not only is there a greater amount of ease in my entire life, but now I feel like I must have had cement blocks chained to my freaking shoulders, holding me there. And now those have been clipped and I'm floating without effort, right? The capacity immediately increases to even allow yourself in those moments where you don't feel safe to not have to protect, because you know that it's going to be okay. And it's about reversing even that pattern that's so real. So again, I'm saying this just as proof in the pudding, because I want every single person to anecdotally not just understand from the stories and the depth you've shared, but this is real. And that's the way I escaped physical pain.
But your physical pain was just inflammation.
That's all it was.
That's a cell danger response.
Yep.
It's a cellular response to protect you
100%
while you're under attack.
Yep.
The cells become hardened and inflamed, so nothing gets into the cell, but nothing's getting out of the cell.
That's right.
But it's a temporary pause until the danger passes. Then it's supposed to come out of the inflamed state and start circulating again.
Yep.
So for my daughter, it didn't come out of that state. That's why the cells died, and they had to cut 24 inches of the track out, because the cells never went back into circulation. And so when we would be driving, and Bridget, just out of the blue would go, and I'd like, oh, what happened? She goes, I just wasn't breathing. And she would just gasp in air. She realized she was so tense that she had almost forgot to breathe. And then she would the system's not going to let you not breathe. By that point, she hadn't breathed in how many seconds, and she'd have to gasp to get the air in. I couldn't understand it. This is before I understood the program. I didn't understand, why would you gasp for air when you're sitting with me? You're not in any danger. I had no idea that this memory loop was running inside her. Yeah. Until I discovered that, I couldn't have fixed it.
There's no way. Again, you would have been treating symptoms. You would have been treating the external stuff, which is what so many things in this world have taught people: to reduce, eliminate, or avoid pain at all costs. I'm a big believer that we need to feel our pain to understand it, because it points us with perspective. We also know, and you said it best, right? I don't care what category it's in. If we look in religion, we look in sports, we look in business, we look in motherhood, we look in entrepreneurship, whatever the case may be, there are so many narratives that still perpetuate and distribute toxic shame into our society.
Yep.
What do you think is going to be the most successful way that we can normalize and reverse this from a societal perspective? And until that shift takes place, where the toxic shame isn't so prevalent, how can people, I guess, set more effective boundaries so that they are protected but not armored?
The best way is education, because if you can understand where the problem's coming from, you can understand what the solution is. And what I hear all the time when people are sitting with me as I'm describing the science and education of what I learned, the common thing I hear almost in every single case is people say to me, "This is making so much sense now. Now I understand." Right. He says, "Do you understand why you were living with this fear? Do you understand why you were living with this shame? That's nothing wrong with you. It's how the mind protects you. It's using these resources to protect you, not hurt you. Your mind would never hurt you." So when people say to me, "Oh, I sabotaged myself," I go, that is scientifically impossible. Your brain is survival based. Yeah. It will never, ever hurt you and destroy you. It will move you in a new direction that you will perceive as sabotage, but it's actually a protection that your mind is using to try to avoid what it believes is going to be a painful situation.
Yeah.
So I found this is fascinating, an article. Again, I told you, these things kept falling in my lap. It was an article written by a German sniper during World War II. And he wrote about when we fought against the Russians didn't have many weapons. They just had a lot of people. So their strategy was to charge as many people at the German lines to see if they could get somebody through, right? And get as many people into the bunkers to fight hand-to-hand combat. He says, so his job as a sniper was to shoot them and kill them. He says, but there would just be another wave. He says, and then I figured out how to stop them. He says, I didn't kill them. I shot them in the stomach, the most painful place to be shot. Now when all these Russian comrades are lying on the ground, screaming and writhing in pain, the next wave would go, yeah, I'm good.
I'm good. Which is interesting because the pain is more of a deterrent than death in that example.
100%. And that's why I said, when I read that, I said, that explains why people will avoid pain. And when people say to me, suicide, how do you explain people committing suicide? I said, suicide's about pain, not about death.
The suffering is so bad, there is no other alternative.
They can't find another resource to stop the pain. So suicide is the only resource left. It's not about wanting to die. So the people left behind will say, why would they do that? They knew I loved them. Why would they do that to me? They just had no way to solve their pain. It wasn't about you. It was about their pain.
Yeah. It's so right. Do you have any areas of your life that you find yourself protecting consciously or unconsciously?
Probably, I would say maybe more before than now, right? I was very private, right? Because I was sort of following what Bridget had told me was to protect our secrets, right? And so once I started working on this research and figuring it out, that no longer affects me.
You started talking about everything. Yeah.
Oh, the best part is when Bridget told me you can never share this, now everybody knows.
I was going to say, everybody knows it now, right? Like, But I think that that's the most freeing thing, because I believe that we exist in suffering in 4 places. The things that are left unsaid, the things we lack permission to feel or say, the things we lack the words to articulate or understand, and the things that are left undone. By talking about things, by sharing our truths, every time that happens, we're giving somebody permission to feel and say something they may not have otherwise. And sometimes words to articulate or understand their situation so they can act and do, which is really what you're saying. At the end of the day, to remove the interference and resistance that exists, we have to reboot ourselves so that we can actually be seeing things for what's right in front of us versus what our minds are convincing us we're reacting to. And it's so beautiful to hear you simplify this.
Yeah. And that's what it was for my wife. If Bridget had tried to talk about it, she would have broke down and cried.
Yeah.
Because her mind would have been looping through the memory to discuss it, which would have created the pain. And so there's the emotion, right? Yeah. The emotion is the way the mind responds to pain. So now it's so amazing to be able to watch her go to an event with me and sit there and share her experiences without shaking and crying.
Beautiful.
Yeah. She's healed. Same with my daughter. Same kind of thing. I worked with a coach who was she did women's retreats. Yep. And when she sat down with me, she says, I feel like a fraud. I have imposter syndrome. And I said, so explain where that's coming from. She says, I've had trauma in my life. She says, and I never share it with my groups. She goes, I'm afraid that if I start talking about it, I'll break down. And what kind of a coach am I if I'm falling apart? She goes, I'll lose all my clients.
She'll be the best kind.
Yeah. So anyway, what happened was, as I met her 3 months later at a conference, she said to me, she goes, I got to share this with you. She said, I was at my last retreat. And she says, and I'm going on talking about all this stuff. And she says, as I'm talking about it, I'm realizing I'm sharing all my trauma. She says, you took all that shame and guilt out of it. Now I had even unconsciously, she felt safe and she was starting to share. And it felt very, very safe and normal to be able to do that now.
And it's freeing every time we do that for ourselves, because it's an element of processing those things that maybe we haven't processed the same way. Some people do it verbally. Some people do it through conversation. Some people do it by osmosis and listening to other people, right? Yes. And so all of those things are powerful. And I think the reason that I support and advocate that we need to understand the lessons we can extract from our stories so we can be intentional in how we apply them moving forward. Because until we do that work, we're going to remain on that same perpetual cycle. What is the legacy that you are going to leave, my friend?
I think understanding there's a better way. Our minds and bodies are designed to heal. What's interfering, that's a natural process. Healing is a natural process. What gets us stuck is this loop that keeps on running. Because what I say is the mind doesn't want to do maintenance on the body or the mind if you're being chased by a lion. Right? It's going to want to escape the threats first before we do maintenance. So I always say you could run on jagged rocks in bare feet while you're being chased by a bear. You will not feel the pain because your mind will not think that it needs to do any maintenance and to shut down you running and injuring yourself anymore. So it will ignore that pain until you escape. But if you've lived your entire life with this constant fear, right? Your mind's going to have less power and energy to heal. And so why have I been healthy all my life? Because I didn't have their trauma. It's that simple. Yeah. So my brother and sister, who are not genetically related to me, that grew up in the same home I grew up in, none of us have ever been sick. None of us have ever been hospitalized. And we have no genetic connection at all. It all came from nurture.
100% the environment, which is such a beautiful thing and such a beautiful model for what's possible. I wish more people grew up in homes like that. That's what we're trying to normalize through some of our work as well, is to allow this next generation to hopefully finally escape some of the patterns that have continued to be passed down, even to my kids in many cases.
I love what you're doing as well. Is that message needs to be out there that it's possible to heal. It's possible, to feel better, to enjoy your life at the maximum level that you can. All you have to do is get to the root cause. What's interfering with that?
Every single time. Well, Don, I think that's going to be one of the best places to wrap, but I want to make sure that people know how to find you. We'll put stuff in the show notes, but what is the best place for someone to reach out to you if they want to lean in, learn from you, go through the tip method, or any of the above?
Just check out our website, which is the inspiredperformanceinstitute.com. And you'll find all the information. There's tons of testimonials on there from people that maybe somebody resonates with you that they've gone through, whether you're a military vet, a rape survivor, or just have a whole bunch of emotional concussions, right? There's somebody in there that has probably gone through what you've gone through, and you'll hear that it can all be healed.
Don, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks, Brian. Great taking the time.
And for those of you that just watched Don flip his lid, the beautiful part is he didn't have a bunch of trash to unpack from his own, but he learned and realized the trash he acquired with his wife, what started to happen in his trauma with his daughter, and his protectionary nature to make sure that she was going to live a life that was worthwhile, that she could escape some of the interference that comes from disease and destruction because the inflammation that's caused by trauma. He found a solution. He's created a solution, and he's living the solution. His daughter, now 38 years old, doesn't suffer from Crohn's disease, doesn't suffer from those same things that existed. So just like me, she escaped the pain by healing the root. It's always nurture over nature when it comes to dealing with your trash. But it's always going to require you to be honest, be aware, own, and step into it by flipping your lid, scanning your camera. What you can probably tell by now is that I love telling these stories, but what I love even more is the impact that's coming from them. You see, we're on a mission to impact over 1 billion lives as quickly as possible, but to do that, we need you. See, we believe that moved people move people. And so all I'm asking is if you've resonated, connected with any of the messaging, please consider commenting, sharing, leave a rating and review. Thank you so much for tuning into Flipping the Lid. And if you want more information on the show, how to become a guest, how to recommend a guest, or any of the other details, head over to flippingthelid.com. We'll see you there.